Hey people, it's Steel Gamer, and I want to talk about MSI Afterburner and FPS in games and test results. Now, this is going to be a little bit lengthy, but bear with me because I'm guaranteed you're going to find this very interesting. All right, so for the past week, I've been going back and forth with people trying to get an answer, and I can't. And this has to do with the grammatical context of things being explained, people taking results that they have no possible way of using and applying it, and then people just skipping over exactly what I'm talking about, so I decided to make this video. Now, to get to the point of this, I'm going to use the temperature of my GPU, my graphics processing unit, which is an RTX 3090 Ti Founders Edition from NVIDIA. Now, first things first, if I want to find out what the temperature of my GPU is, I have to run a program like MSI Afterburner, which displays the temperature on the screen while I'm running whatever it is I'm running. Now, the first you have to backtrack and say, why would you even do that? That's simple because I just happen to know from working around computers and just the way electronics work in general, that if something gets too hot, it's a problem. I just know that from working around computers, so that would be the reason I would actually want to know what the temperature is. Now, if I wanted to just do a modification on my GPU, regardless of what the temperature was, I could just go ahead and do it, but I would have no way of knowing if the modification I did would actually would have done anything. So that's why I would run MSI Afterburner. Now, what I would first do is I would look up what the average temperature of a 3090 Ti Founders Edition should be. And I would note that. So let's say I think it's like 85 degrees Celsius maximum. If you start going above that, you're going to have a problem. Okay, so I take that information and I run something, and I run MSI Afterburner. Now, regardless of whether it's too hot or not, if I want to make a modification, I'm going to. But let's say for sake of conversation, it was running at 90 degrees Celsius. All right, so what I then do is I would note through several games not only when that temperature hit, like the time, but what I was doing in there, and I write it down. So now I have data where I not only know what temperature it reached, but I know that the temperature would be too high when it happened, and I did this over several games. So I would use the data over several games to basically figure out what the basic temperature of this would be. Now, I want to point out that I just explained a use case for why I would do this and what purpose this has. So now I take the information and I make a modification to my graphics processing unit. Now, the data I have for the temperature doesn't do anything. I can't use that to fix the GPU. Like, the data is just the data. It's not going to make a physical modification to the card, so I can't really physically do anything with the data. I just have the information in order to know, should I or should I not make a modification based off of a hot temperature. So let's say I made the modification and then I put it back in the system. I would then run MSI Afterburner and see if the temperature changed. If so, by how many degrees and whatnot. And I would do that through the games I tested or whatever I tested. Now, if the temperature wasn't that much of a difference, then I would know for future reference that modding this thing wouldn't really do much, so there would be no point in modding it. But if it did change something, I know that the modification would be worth it. Now I have that information. The point to everything I just explained is, I just literally explained that testing a GPU with a temperature has a reason, how I'm getting that information, what I'm doing with the information, why I would need to know it, and after I did something to change it, was it worth it, and should I want to do that in the future? So I just applied an explanation, a full-blown use, an explanation to how I'm using that data, how it's applied, what I'm doing with it, and then the end test result to find my information and answers on what I'm doing with that information for future use or possible future use, and was it worth it. Now, I'm going to apply that same scenario to when people are talking about benchmarking with FPS. As it stands now, there is no FPS data anybody can use, even through MSI Afterburner, that is going to be able to help you identify or do anything. There is no use case for it outside of curiosity. You can't get data to fix anything. There's nothing you can do that the information you get from MSI Afterburner for any FPS does anything outside of just curious to know that factor. I don't care what anybody says, because you have to provide an actual use case for FPS in the same way I just explained, wanting to know what the temperature on the GPU is for. Now, let me bring you up to speed by first explaining. I'm using the example that somebody had in a video of 60 frames per second for what I'm talking about. Now, first things first. I'm going to get a phrase out of the way that's kind of weird, so bear with me, but I'll make my point in a minute. In churches, people use a phrase of, I tithe 10% of my money. They say that exact phrase. Now, what the point of this is that the word tithe does not belong being used in front of or in the same sentence as 10%. You can't say, I tithe 10% of my money and have that grammatically make sense, because tithe itself means 10%. So what you're saying when you say I tithe 10% of my money is I 10% of my money. You have to remove the 10% or the word tithe for that sentence to even make grammatical sense. Now I'll get to my point, because that applies to low 1%. Okay, when it comes to the grammatical explanation, low 1% is the equivalency of saying I tithe 10% of my money. Just like you can't 10% of your money, you can't 1% of 60. And again, 60 FPS. And let me explain why I'm reading it that way. Low 1% are the exact same thing as tithe and 10%. Low means the lowest percent of, in this case, 60. So it's the lowest percent of 60. 1% of 60 is the lowest percent of 60. Low and 1% in a grammatical context in this instance means exactly the same thing. You are literally saying I 1% of 60. Now, if that's not grammatically correct, I have yet to find anybody to explain why it's even phrased that way. That's the first problem. Now I'm going to bring in a secondary issue. In the example I saw with 60 frames per second, the low 1% had the number 40 next to it. Excuse me? When you're dealing with 60 and you are dealing with percents, grammatically and mathematically, 1% of 60 can never be 40. You cannot get 40 as the lowest percent of 60. It is mathematically impossible, and grammatically, since the phrase hasn't been explained, you can't have that either. So the lowest percent of 60 is 0.6. The lowest 1% of 60 is 0.6, meaning the low 1% of 60 will never be anything more than 0.6. It'll never fluctuate. It'll never change. It will never do anything, which is why I specifically stated FPS cannot be used to identify any lag or anything else because of the grammatical phrasing in this program that nobody seems to want to explain. Now, when I've asked this, all people do is they take the result of 1% of 60 or lowest point of percent 60, and they start explaining all this crap that has nothing to do with the fact that they're ignoring where the hell did the number 40 come from. Mathematically, I don't care what anybody's trying to use the result as. Where the hell did you get 40? How did 40 come out of the equation of 1% of 60? It's not possible. Now let me explain what another problem that people are having, that I'm having with people when they're dealing with 0.6. Frames per second means you have one full frame, and then there are so many of those one full frames on the screen per second. So if you say 60 FPS, you have a full frame, you have 60 full frames being displayed a second. Now let me explain this. I'm going to use this placemat as the frame. You have a frame. This will never be 0.6 of a of a so let me put this on the table here. Okay, when you say 0.6 FPS, you are saying that this frame is missing part of it. So in other words, sorry, I'm going to try to get this up. So if I fold this corner in, I have a percent of the frame. Frames can never be in a fraction. They're either one full thing or they're not. What is in that frame can alter, but you can't alter the frame itself. So the phrasing of frames per second and then being 0.6 is not even possible. You cannot have 0.6 of a frame. You can have the frames, you can have 60 frames, and you can have something inside those frames only being displayed partially, but you can't have the frame itself as 0.6. It just doesn't exist. And that is exactly the way this is phrased. So I don't care if people say that's not what this means. Grammatically, nobody has explained why you're even reading this stuff half-assed. Because as far as I'm concerned, the clash is coming from, I understand how to read, I also understand how math is applied, and I understand that you cannot get 40 from 60, no matter how hard you try when you're dealing with 1% or the lowest percent of 60, which is why it's important to explain grammatically why you don't read it that way or why this is even worded that way. All anybody is doing is taking the end result and ignoring the fact that I want to know how the hell you're getting 40 out of this. Where the hell does 40 come from? Now, unless you have full-blown frames, like 60 FPS, you can't use 0.6 to get an average. 0.6 is not a number for a frame. You can say 0.6 is the amount of time that the frame is being displayed on the screen, but you can't say the frame itself is only on the, you can't say 0.6 of a frame is on the screen. It just doesn't work. So nobody has explained anything about this grammatically that can even be rationally understood. Now, if you had a problem with that, let me bring up low 0.1%, which in this case off of 60 is 0.06. What the hell are these numbers? Now, even if you had, for some random reason, I don't know how the hell you're getting it, but let's just say for sake of conversation, you somehow are using this to get an average of 50 for some screwed up reason. Don't know how that number, I'm throwing this out. What the hell does the end result have to do with anything that is usable? I explained to you how I took the GPU and wanted to know the temperature. I gave you a reason why, what I'm doing with the information, how I'm getting the information, how I'm applying it, and stuff for future reference. Like, I literally have an actual use, and I explained it all. FPS is not being explained for a use case. And all people are saying is, low 1% is the most important thing. Important thing for what? It doesn't, this whole thing is not being explained at all so it can be understood. And instead, all those people are acting like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. This is important. I don't give a crap about your explanations. I want you to know how you're getting this, how this math is working out, and the grammatical phrasing. Otherwise, I don't care who you are. Jay's 2 cents, Gamers Nexus. I don't care if you're doing programming. Nobody is going to tell me that the way this is set up right now can even be used. And again, you have no use case for FPS. So there is literally no reason, other than you being curious to what the FPS is, there is literally no reason at all you need the FPS for anything. People that want to argue this can say, well, you're doing comparisons. Comparisons on what? You can't take that information and use a comparison the way you did the temperature on the GPU because you don't have any numbers to, you can't even apply this data to anything to want to fix anything. You want better FPS, get better hardware. That's how this works. And also, I'm going to make one last point on this. If the FPS drops from, let's say, 60 to 40, that does not indicate there is a problem anywhere in the game that the FPS or the low 1% or the low 0.1% matters. That doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't do anything. All that shows is that the game went to 40 FPS. So what? That's not a big deal. The game just loads. There is nothing you can use, FPS data-wise, that will fix that problem. Now, if you are going to tell me that I'm using FPS in the same exact way I'm using the temperature of the GPU, I'd like somebody to explain that. Because I'd like to know, without upgrading any hardware, how the hell are you supposed to fix a drop in an FPS with a stat that doesn't do anything? It doesn't make any sense. Not to mention, you don't even explain how to read the stat or how the stuff is grammatically worded. This whole thing and all of these programs are total nonsense because nobody is bothering to break anything down so it can be rationally and comprehensively understood. Now, I just explained this entire thing as a problem. So anybody that's going to debate me needs to literally break down all the points that I made in this. Otherwise, you have no talking points. It is that simple. Now, if I'm reading the program wrong, I have yet to have anybody explain to me how. So, that's it. TL Gamer signing out. Have a good one.